Hoş geldiniz. Öncelikle Sürdürülebilir Ekonomi ve Finans Araştırmaları Derneği adına bugünkü webinarımıza katıldığınız için teşekkür ederek başlamak istiyorum. Öncelikle de ev sahibi olarak bazı hatırlatmalarla başlayayım. So some housekeeping announcements before we start. Good morning. So we will be recording this webinar. Bu webinarda kayıt alacağız. Onun için eğer görüntünüzün çıkmasını istemiyorsanız kameranızı kapatabilirsiniz. You can turn off your camera if you do not want to appear on the screen. And we have simultaneous translation throughout the webinar. Webinar boyunca aynı zamanda tercüme de olacak, simultane tercüme de olacak. Tercüme kanalından Türkçe, İngilizce ya da orijinal sesle izleyebilirsiniz. So you can click on the little world icon at the bottom to switch to English or Turkish or the original channel. Bu hatırlatmalardan sonra tekrar SEFiA ve RFI Vakfı ile birlikte ortak düzenlediğimiz bu webinara hoş geldiniz diyeyim. Bugün aslında bugünlerde özellikle hepimiz için çok önemli olan bir konuyla ilgili hem bir rapor tanıtımı, raporun ardından da bir panel tartışmasıyla devam edeceğiz. Türkiye'de finansal sistem içerisinde bulunan emisyonların, finanse edilen emisyonların ölçümüyle ilgili önemli bir rapor var önümüzde. Bu gibi ölçümler özellikle son dönemde bizim için yol gösterici. Neden yol gösterici? Aslında çok hızlı bir gelişmelere şahit olduğumuz bir dönemdeyiz. Bir yandan işte iklim krizinin etkilerini görüyoruz, artan etkileri görüyoruz. Aşırı hava olaylarıyla, buna bağlı işte hasar ve kayıplarla karşılaşıyoruz. Bu artık günümüzün gündelik hayatımızda sık sık karşılaştığımız ve hepimizi de aslında endişelendiren bir gündem. Diğer tarafta da işte Avrupa Yeşil Mutabakatı'nda gördüğümüz gibi küresel durgunluğa karşı bir yeni ekonomik büyüme patikasının arayışı içerisinde dünya. Bunun iklim krizinin de getirdiği acil dönüşüm ihtiyacıyla birlikte bir ana akımlaşan iklim politikasıyla, daha merkez siyasetin konusu olmaya başlayan bir iklim politikasıyla karşılaşıyoruz. Ve Türkiye'de aslında bu gelişmeleri özellikle Yeşil Mutabakat nedeniyle de çok yakından takip ediyor. Gündem tabii çok uluslararası yapısı gereği, çok boyutlu niteliği gereği de pek çok farklı alanı kapsıyor. Sadece artık çevre ve enerji politikalarından bahsetmek mümkün değil. İşte kamu maliyesinden istihdam politikalarına, eğitim, sanayi, ticaret ve hatta artık yani şimdi özellikle de bu savaş konjonktüründe ortaya çıktığı gibi güvenlik politikaları bağlamında da değerlendirmek gerekiyor iklim politikalarını. Özellikle son 1,5-2 yılda enerji piyasalarında yaşanmakta olan fiyat dalgalanmaları, ciddi artışlar, Rusya-Ukrayna Savaşı ile birlikte de ciddi bir küresel enerji krizinin ortaya çıkmasına ve hatta fosil yakıta bağımlı bir küresel düzenin ne kadar kırılgan olduğunu da ortaya çıkarmış durumda. Bütün bu gelişmeler ışığında yani gerek işte ekonomik büyüme, yeni büyüme patikaları, enerji krizi, savaş, bütün bu gelişmeler ışığında düşük karbonlu bir ekonomiye dönüşümde hızlanarak devam ediyor, devam etmesi gerekiyor en azından iklim politikalarını, iklim hedeflerini odağa aldığımızda. Her ne kadar bu savaşla birlikte enerji krizi ve işte kısa vadede enerji arz güvenliği önemli bir konu haline gelmiş olsa da orta uzun vadede doğrultunun yani dönüşüm doğrultusunun değişmeyeceğini de görüyoruz. Bu bütün taraflarca da beyan ediliyor. Tabii bugün tartışacağımız finans sektörü bu dönüşümün çok merkezi bir yerinde yer alıyor. Yani yalnızca tabii bu ihtiyaç duyulan, dönüşümün ihtiyacı olan yatırımlara kaynak sağlaması açısından değil, aynı zamanda hedeflerle çelişen alanlardaki yatırımlardan çekilme ya da bu alanlara yatırım yapılmaması konusunda da önemli bir rol oynuyor finans dünyasının aldığı kararlar. Yani finans sektörünün ne yaptığı kadar ne yapmadığı da önemli aslında iklim hedefleri açısından. Bu konuda da tabii hızlanan bir gündem de var. Buna da şahit oluyoruz. Sadece 2021 yılına baktığımızda kömür yatırım planlarından çıkan, bu yatırımların önümüzdeki dönemde kendi portföyü içerisinde yer almayacağını açıklayan pek çok finans kurumu olduğunu görüyoruz. Net sıfır olma hedeflerini benimsemiş olan finans kuruluşlarının sayısı giderek artıyor. Bugün 300'ü aşmış durumda küresel olarak. İşte 93 trilyon dolarlık bir varlığı temsil ediyorlar. Pandemi sürecinde de aslında yani bu dönüşümün, bu açıklamaların hızını kesmediğini görüyoruz. 2020-2021 yılları arasında 77 tane küresel banka, sigorta şirketi, emeklilik fonu, varlık yöneticisi mevcut kömürden çıkış planlarını ya revize etmiş durumda ya da yeni çıkış planları açıklıyorlar. Bu da geleceğe doğru aslında finans dünyasının da ciddi anlamda bir dönüşümü gerçekleştirmekte olduğunu gösteriyor bize. Benzer açıklamalara Taraflar Konferansı'nda da şahit olduk. Bir takım ittifaklar ortaya çıktı. İşte net sıfır için Glasgow Finansal İttifakı bunlardan bir tanesi. Bununla birlikte G20'de, G7'de ve OECD koalisyonunda bir takım gelişmeler oluyor. Benzer yöndeki eğilimler Türkiye'de de bu arada ortaya çıkıyor. Türkiye'deki finansal kuruluşlar arasında bir takım açıklamalara şahit oluyoruz. İşte Garanti, Akbank, Yapı Kredi gibi bankalar, hatta son dönemde QNB Finans Bank'ın da bu gruba eklendiğini görüyoruz. Yeni kömürlü termik santral finansmanından çıktıklarını açıkladı bu kurumlar. Bunların hepsi de bizim için Türkiye'deki finansal sistemi değerlendirmek açısından ve aslında fosil yakıtın finansmanını değerlendirmek açısından önemli girdiler. Düzenleyici kurumlar arasında da tabii benzer ittifaklar oluşuyor ki bu ittifaklardan bir tanesine hem Bankacılık Düzenleme ve Denetleme Kurumu'nun hem de Merkez Bankası'nın dahil olduğunu biliyoruz. Network for Greening Financial System, NGFS. Bunlar tabii çok yeni gelişmeler. Hepimizin yakından takip ettiği, önümüzdeki dönemde nasıl etkilerinin olacağını yakından takip ettiğimiz önemli gelişmeler. Bunlar neden önemli aslında? Bu fosil yakıt finansmanından çıkış, bu yönde alınan kararlar neden önemli? Yalnızca bizim açımızdan hani iklim hedeflerini öne alan kurumlar açısından dönüşümün hızını öngörebilmek için değil, aynı zamanda finans sektörü üzerindeki dönüşüm risklerini öngörebilmek açısından da önemli. Çünkü bugün finanse edilen varlıkların ekonomik ömürlerini tamamlamadan düşük karbonlu ekonomiye geçişle birlikte karşı karşıya kalacakları bir atıllaşma riski söz konusu. Bu da aslında finansal sistem açısından da önemli bir risk unsuru. Bu riskleri ölçebilmek hepimiz açısından çok kritik. Onun için de bugün tartışacağımız rapor önemli bir başlangıç noktası. Rapor finansal kuruluşların proje finansmanı gibi yöntemlerle doğrudan finanse ettikleri emisyonları değil, yalnızca dolaylı yoldan finanse ettikleri emisyonları da bize gösteriyor. Ayrıca karbon emisyonlarını sadece enerji sektörüyle ya da altyapı, üst yapı projelerine sağlanan finansmanla değil, daha geniş anlamda diğer sektörler üzerinde de etkilerine bakarak değerlendiriyor. Bu da raporun bir başka katma değeri. Ben buradan başlayarak raporun sunumunu yapmak üzere RFI Vakfı Genel Müdürü Blake Wood'a sözü bırakmak istiyorum. Tekrar katılımınız için çok teşekkür ediyorum. Heyecanla hem rapor sunumunu hem de sonrasında yapacağımız panel tartışmalarını bekliyorum. Teşekkür ederim.
Thank you, and thank you for the comprehensive overview of kind of where we are and how we've gotten here, particularly as it pertains to the financial sector and financial regulation. because over the time period, and this report is one of several that we've been working on, covering many markets that have that are defined by across them by a presence of Islamic finance. As so, even though the report doesn't focus exclusively on Islamic finance, because Islamic finance is one piece of a bigger puzzle within the financial sector to address and identify climate-related financial risks. And we've seen dramatic change over the year to year and a half that we've been creating these reports, and it fits into the underlying motivation, which has been outlined very well through an initiative from the UN supported Principles for Responsible Investment, which they call it the inevitable policy response. And what the inevitable policy response really says is that if we look at the commitments that were made in 2015 at Paris of what objectives the world collectively wanted to, and the signatories to the Paris Agreement wanted to achieve by 2030, particularly at that time, and even now, 2030 seems quite a way off from corporate planning horizons, government planning horizons, where it's starting to now be in kind of towards the end of common planning horizons. And so the inevitable policy response is really a conceptual framework for how do you get the changes that will be required between now and 2030. How do you think of that in terms of how it matters to companies and financial institutions and regulators and governments today? And so it effectively works backwards from 2030 to the present day, with a series of events where there's going to be a ratchet up in policy required at certain points. So Glasgow is one of them, because that was the interim targets. It had been delayed by a year by COVID, but interim targets from the 5-year on point from the Paris Agreement. We'll have another one of those in 2025. And in between then, next year, there'll be a global stocktake of emissions that gives us an indication of how likely the transition to reach 2030 goals is likely to be orderly or disorderly, or disorganized or organized. And so that process of working through those interim steps really defines a pathway that presents challenges and opportunities today, and also defines a framework for understanding how this transition will affect the current financing decisions and the implications of that over the next couple of years. And so that's really the framework that we've worked in, because the speed and intensity of the policy change that will come about over this time are hard to conceptualize and translate into actionable points in another way. So, and I think reflective of this within the financial sector, what we've seen over the past 6 months, 6 to 9 months, we've seen a set of principles for effective climate risk management and supervision come out from the Basel Committee for Banking Supervision. We've seen that comment period complete, then they've released the final principles. At that point when that was starting, there was also still no single reference point for disclosures other than the recommendations from the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD. But now we've seen draft principles come out through the International Sustainability Standards Board under the IFRS Foundation. So all of these things are really showing that the wheels behind policy, behind financial regulation, although they turn slowly, they are moving in the direction of what's needed to achieve the 2030 objectives, and will continue to do so. So it's just understanding that this is a continual dynamic process. Data is one big challenge in translating that into actionable insights, and that's what we've tried to do with this report, and then follow-on research to expand upon that. And I'll mention it at the end, but just as a point, with once you start getting regulators involved through the NGFS, the Network for Greening the Financial System, as Bengisu mentioned, then you start seeing things like the Bank of England doing climate stress tests of financial institutions, and you start to build a framework for how to understand the changes and the implications. And then it becomes a question of how do you start with the data limitations that exist, because you can't wait till the data is perfect to start acting, as you can't anywhere in the economy. So with that framing, I'll go right into the presentation. So the methodology we use is to start from the point that we know the top down level of emissions, and we know where financial assets are across the economy. So what we're trying to do is allocate each ton of greenhouse gas emissions in the economy as a whole across the financial sector to see which parts of the financial sector are financing which types of emissions. So on a direct basis, that would be looking at the energy generating sector. We know that around 34% of the overall emissions are from the electricity generating sector. And we know that 39% of the financed emissions within the banking sector are in electricity generation. So we see that there's a stronger concentration of financed emissions within the banking sector. And as the risks grow over the transition period for things like stranded assets, that risk, because of that composition, is going to be slightly more felt within the banking sector. So that's how we've taken this, because there's not company level disclosures, measurements of greenhouse gas emissions. There has to be some other way to calculate it. And so the methodology that we developed is an adaptation of one that was developed in France by Crédit Agricole along with the university. And then it had been piloted several times by the French Agency for Ecological Transition, ADIM. And so we've adapted it from a single financial institution operating across multiple countries into a model of how to break down emissions within a single country across multiple financial institutions and other parts of the financial sector. So that's the direct customer emissions. So a power plant is emitting CO2, and so that those emissions get captured into the financial institutions' financed emissions, which under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is in scope 3, category 15. It gets a little technical, and then there's additional frameworks that have been developed since then to go beyond there and start to talk about how do you look at this in the context of broader net zero plans. But then all of these things aren't just limited to financed emissions from directly emitted greenhouse gases from the customers. It's also the value chain that's going into the customers that impacts the financed emissions of a bank or a bond or a sukuk or a listed company's shares. And so we try to come up with a metric that also takes the three largest sources of emissions that impact the value chain, which is electricity generation, transportation, and waste management, and allocate that out across the sectors that are providing the underlying demand for those services. So a retail store has a very small direct emissions footprint, but it does have some incrementally higher footprint once you count the power that it uses or the transportation of goods to get from the suppliers into the retail stores. So what we're trying to do is provide an estimate of that. That runs into a lot of challenges around double counting, particularly when you get to the non-electricity inputs into various sectors. And so we've tried to take a balance of, we know the direct emissions don't have overlap. We know that the indirect emissions do have overlap. So we've tried to minimize and offset one against the other, so that the total emissions that we're showing on both the direct side and the indirect side are equal to the total emissions in the economy. So you can't view one completely independently of the other. They provide greater insight viewed together of looking at direct and indirect emissions. So that summary that I gave is kind of summarized in this graph, which is this is a simple example of financial sector financing four sectors, two directly and two indirectly, and it's showing how we define the boundary, the emissions boundary of where do we stop counting. How we want to go to the direct customers of the financial institutions or the directly financed projects of the capital markets instruments, and then we want to go towards those indirect sources that are significant. So in this simple example, it's electricity and waste management. We add transportation also in the reports analysis, and so we say there are some all of the electricity emissions with some minor exceptions, because the power plant needs to have its own lights on, and waste management and transportation is the same thing. Most of that is going to be reflected as indirect emissions of some other sector. So on the indirect emissions calculations, we're taking all of the electricity, transportation, waste management emissions out of their primary source and allocating them across other sectors. And we're doing that based on GDP shares, because we're coming from the top-down level to try to get the orders of magnitude of where the emissions are financed on a direct basis and how the indirect emissions are linking together different sectors' financed emissions footprints. And so the reason we're focused on this is because financed emissions do represent a cost to the customers that currently may be unpriced, but increasingly, whether through direct carbon pricing, whether that's trade-based or otherwise, or regulations that impose costs to emitting greenhouse gases or block the emission over a certain threshold, all of those have some cost. And so there's not a way to predict in terms of the policy mix, and it'll be different in different sectors and different countries. And so we look at emissions as a whole. And so the cost of that is going to rise over time as the Paris Agreement ratchet effect works between now and 2030. And that's going to affect the creditworthiness of customers. It's going to impact the financial outcomes of companies, and therefore also on their bonds, sukuk, and shares. And the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, which is part of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, has been increasing also in how investors and asset owners who are directing, whose investments are being directed, are increasingly factoring in financed emissions and emissions into their valuation models, and how they value their investments one against another. And the asset owners in that now are at 61 trillion, and that's been growing pretty steadily all this year. That was as of May 31st. This initiative launched in December of 2020. So over a fairly short period of time, it's gained significant traction within the investor community. So here are the breakdown of the just emissions across the economy in Turkey. And the electricity, transportation are two of the big sectors, and together with waste management account for about 51% of total emissions. Manufacturing, construction, and agriculture are also significant sources of emissions. And so the report is going to allocate all of these emissions across the financial sector, financial institutions, as well as capital markets, as well as then trace some of the interdependencies of electricity demand from manufacturing sectors. Is also there's an impact if you're a bank you're financing a whole range of sectors. And so your portfolio, you can invest in renewable energy projects, and that will have an impact on reducing overall emissions. But to the extent that new power generation is just keeping up with significantly rising demand, because as the economy is growing and particularly among emerging markets, faster economic growth is leading to faster electricity demand growth, that if you're also investing in and financing energy efficiency improvements in the manufacturing sector, it's effectively increasing the impact of that renewable energy investment because it's slowing demand growth. And so every new kilowatt hour of power generated from renewable sources, is more of it is going towards offsetting higher emitting sources of electricity versus just keeping up with the demand growth. So it recognizes that banks in particular have, and investors that have diversified portfolios, have the ability to influence across multiple different sectors, and those are complementary with one another. So the share of financed emissions across the economy is heavily concentrated within the banking sector. Some of that is reflected in here. You can, by comparing the left and right, you can see that some of the bank financing to particularly the electricity sector is also then creating financed emissions within capital markets, because sectors that are more dependent on financing from bonds, sukuk, and equity financing are providing that demand, that end demand for electricity. And so when you're looking at the indirect emissions, those sectors are picking up some of that electricity emissions that are being financed by banks. And so this is how you can look at two sides of the same coin by looking at the scope 1 direct emissions and then the fuller emissions. And on the right, as I mentioned before, we've tried to remove double counting. So when we reallocate the electricity emissions to manufacturing or to another sector, we're reducing it from the electricity sector and adding it to the other sector. So it adds up to the same total. It doesn't. The challenge with scope 3 is that everyone's scope 3 is somebody else's direct emissions, and sometimes multiple other people's indirect emissions. So the methodological challenges of capturing this data, especially when data goes beyond scope 1, which is included whether you're looking at the greenhouse gas protocol or the portfolio or the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, PCAF, or the outlines from the ISSB climate standard. They're all saying you have to look beyond the direct emission source when you're calculating emissions and reporting it. And so then within the banking sector, you can see that there's also this very big shift in terms of direct versus direct and other indirect sources that reflects primarily the reallocation of electricity emissions. So on a primary basis, around 35 to 40% of bank financed emissions are coming from the electricity sector. But when you look at it, reallocating those emissions to where the demand for the electricity is coming from, the manufacturing sector is gaining a significant amount of emissions, as well as other sectors. So there's the ability to use the interlinkages in where the finance emissions are coming from to impact beyond just in the directly financed emissions. So financial institutions can reduce their climate-related financial risk by looking at more than just financing renewable energy. There's lots of different potentials that have complementary impact. It's a little bit harder to make estimates around the retail financing, but we've done and tried to make an estimate, and this gives point to some of the differences between how the finance emissions picture looks within conventional banks versus participation banks. And it's particularly notable that transport vehicles is an area where participation banks have higher exposure through their financing portfolio, in part because it's easier to organize, to arrange Sharia compliant financing where there's a tangible asset like a vehicle that can be relatively easily financed. And so it provides an area where participation banks can be particularly competitive, which also then creates the risk of, if there's a reduction in internal combustion engines, is there a suitable plan to look at all mobility solutions in the financing to make up that share of financing over time as the composition of vehicles sold is changing. And it also gives a lever for participation banks to use to show more than other financial institutions that they're being proactive on this process, to both reduce their risk from the reduction in internal combustion engine sales, but also use that as an opportunity to gain market share in other mobility offerings that are growing to fill the gap, because people and things still need to move around. So on this slide, it's showing some of the overall the differences between the portfolios and the financed emissions that are a result within conventional banks and participation banks. And there's both are broadly diversified across the economy. There's some sectors that have more financing from participation banks relative to conventional banks, some sectors that are the other way around. And so this is the direct emissions picture, and it changes a bit when you're looking at the indirect sources of emissions being reallocated, because in particular, the agriculture sector has a much higher share from conventional banks, whereas the wholesale and retail trade, construction are the reverse, where the participation banks have more financing in this area and thus more financed emissions once you account for the underlying electricity, transportation, and waste management related emissions. So this is a similar picture to the previous two slides, but it's consolidated across all banks, not breaking out by conventional or participation banks. And it's looking at the difference between the direct emissions and indirect emissions. And so it's showing where, and you can see it's blank here in electricity and transportation and waste management, because those are the sectors, if it was shown, those would be negative on here, because you're in the process of reallocating, you're moving it out of those three sectors. And here's how it's being reallocated into across the banking sector, where it's picking up significant indirect emissions in manufacturing, wholesale and retail trade, construction, agriculture, and then across other sectors of the financial markets, that equities gain significant financed emissions from the manufacturing sector, as well as smaller sectors that have some electricity demand, but generally have relatively low direct emissions, such as other business activities, education, healthcare, real estate. So it's showing with how the interconnection is happening between direct and indirect sources of emissions. So then the conclusions here, the main one is, as we've seen with the changes in development and regulatory policy and focus on climate-related financial risks, it's especially important for investors and financial institutions to analyze the financed emissions footprint that they have. And that's particularly important in the case of Turkey with exporters to the European Union, since the European Union is on the path to introducing a carbon border adjustment mechanism to levelize the internal and imported carbon prices. And that's going to be, I think, a significant disclosure and data collection challenge. And so even though that mechanism will come into place for several years, tracking and understanding how that will impact customers will be important as a source to prepare for potential climate-related financial risks. And then also within that process of looking at direct and indirect emissions, there's a fairly high share of renewable energy within the power mix, largely hydro, which the power mix of electricity generation is going to be divergent between different parts of the country, and so factoring in some of the localized scenarios in understanding what we've done has been just top down from the entire country, but different parts of the country will have different embedded emissions from the indirect electricity demanded by other sectors. So within the policy area, some of these are examples from other countries. So in Malaysia, capital markets stakeholders have provided incentive programs that help defray some of the initial upfront costs for labeled bond and sukuk issuance. Singapore has done it, Malaysia has done it, focusing initially on the sukuk issuance in particular. Singapore was more general. And so that was providing some offset and some relief on the upfront cost for the reviews required in the process of developing green, social, or sustainability bond frameworks. In other places, I mentioned the UK as well as the Netherlands have undertaken climate stress tests. The other regulators are now in the process of laying out frameworks and timelines for when they will undertake climate-related financial risk stress testing. For example, Malaysia, I believe, has set a three-year time frame for when they'll be doing a climate stress test of all financial institutions. Typically, those are done directly between the regulator and the financial institutions, and the results that they release out of that are for the financial sector as a whole, and it's not being used directly to impact capital levels. But as regulators are moving along, getting more comfortable using these tools, it's starting to factor into questions about introducing incentives, positive or negative, such as a green supporting factor, that would adjust capital requirements. And there's been small experiments on this lines. Indonesia, for example, has introduced reduced capital requirements for banks financing things related to electric vehicle production. So it's kind of a wide open at this point how individual financial authorities are approaching it. But it is something that they're working together through the network for greening the financial system and sharing experience and building capacity quite quickly. There's a wealth of resources in terms of scenarios, in terms of experiences of banks and regulators undertaking some of these policies that really provides a clear roadmap for where the regulation is heading. And so with all of these things, it's better to kind of get as much information up front and start factoring it in, even if it begins as a qualitative exercise or a rough order of magnitude quantitative exercise like what we've done. But it also opens up opportunities, as I mentioned. So with the labeled bond and sukuk issuance, that provides a great entry point to new investor base. There are a huge number of investors, and I mentioned the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance has 61 trillion of assets who are looking for either labeled or unlabeled issuance that is aligned to Paris Agreement targets or is supporting the transition. And as I mentioned, with the participation banks in particular on the mobility financing, that provides an opportunity because they do have a higher market share in that financing area relative to their share in the overall financial system. And so anticipating and being proactive on offering other mobility solutions can help kind of further that market share advantage as the transportation sector does change over time. So that is the conclusion of the presentation. The report is now available at the RFI website, rfi-foundation.org. And so I'll just stop now, and I think we will hear from our other panelists.
Blake sunumu için çok teşekkür ediyoruz. Çok gerçekten önemli bir rapor. Başlangıç noktası olarak çok önemli bir rapor. Çünkü sınırlı veri içerisinde aslında bize en azından risklere nasıl bakmamız gerektiğini, hem finansal sektör üzerindeki riski ama bunun dolaylı olarak da aslında Türkiye'nin üretim ve ticaret yapısı içerisindeki riskleri de bize gösteriyor bu rapor. Bu açıdan çok önemli. Burada altı çizilmiş bütün riskler ve Blake'in özellikle son slaytında bahsettiği farklı yaklaşımlar, örnekler Şubat ayında gerçekleştirilen iklim şurası sırasında hem karbon fiyatlaması hem iklim finansmanı üzerine gerçekleştirilen tartışmalarda taraflar tarafından hem kamu hem özel sektör tarafından derinlemesine tartışıldı. Pek çok ilerleme var aslında bu alanda. Ama bir yandan da tabii hızla farklı gelişmelerinde ortaya çıkması gerekiyor. Biliyoruz ki dünyada da aslında gelişmekte olan bir alan. Hani herkes kendi yöntemleriyle bir şekilde hem riske hem de yeşil kalkınmanın finansmanına ilişkin yaklaşımlar geliştiriyor. Şimdi ben hani sözü daha da fazla uzatmayayım, panelimize geçelim. Çok değerli katılımcılarımız var panelimizde. Cumhurbaşkanlığı Finans Ofisi Katılım Finans Dairesi Başkanı Sayın Tarık Akın ve Kuveyt Türk Katılım Bankası Finansal Kurumlar Müdürü Turgay Çavaş bizlerle birlikte. Ben panelistlerimize aslında hem ortak bir soruyla başlamak istiyorum. Raporla ilgili değerlendirmelerini alırken aynı zamanda kendilerinin, hani kendi alanlarında, kendi kurumlarında iklim değişikliği riskleriyle ilgili ne gibi girişimlerde bulundukları, hem ölçüm hem risk yönetimiyle ilgili ne gibi stratejiler izlediklerini soracağım. İzniniz olursa öncelikle Tarık Bey'le başlamak istiyorum. Ama Tarık Bey'e bu soruları sorarken bir özel sorum da tabii ki hani bulundukları pozisyon itibariyle Türkiye'nin 2053 net sıfır hedefine yönelik ne gibi bir stratejileri var? Onu da sormak istiyorum. Tarık Bey buyurun, söz sizin. Konuşmalarımızı o 15 dakikayla sınırlarsak sonrasında da katılımcılarımızdan, izleyicilerimizden soru cevaplarla devam edeceğiz. Teşekkür ederim.
Teşekkürler Bengüsü Hanım. Değerli panelistler, dinleyiciler, katılımcılar. Ben izninizle 15 dakika içinde hem sorularınıza cevap vermeye hem de yani sorularınıza cevap veren hem de ne yaptığımızı anlatan bir sunum gerçekleştireceğim. Ama İngilizce devam etmek istiyorum izin verirseniz. Bilek'te de böylece daha belki interaktif biçimde şey yapabiliriz. Good day everyone. Blake's presentation ends with some recommendations on participation banks. And implementing these recommendations requires a kind of holistic strategic action. And I will talk and I will continue from that point, and I will try to explain what we are doing to develop a strategic plan for the participation financial sectors. In my presentation, in my talk, I will focus on sustainable and green finance from the lens of participation finance. I will try to summarize what the sectors has achieved up to now and our strategy to align participation finance more with green and sustainable finance. Let me start with a very brief introduction on the importance of participation finance for the Istanbul Financial Center project and the mandate of the Department of Participation Finance. This brief introduction, this short introduction will help the audience where we, as a Department of Participation Finance, stand in designing the overall strategy, more correctly, overall sustainability strategy for the participation financial sectors, including banking, capital markets, insurance, and social finance. It is now a commonly accepted phenomenon that the current global financial architecture is now on the brink of a big transformation. We believe that Islamic finance, with its pillars of asset-basedness, risk sharing, and compliance with ethical and moral values, offers an important alternative to the ongoing financial system, which creates indebtedness, inequalities, and diverges from real economy. Given the prospective contribution of Islamic or participation finance in formation of a new financial architecture, participation finance is one of the two pillars of the Istanbul Financial Center project. By the way, the other pillar is fintech. Needless to say that the current state of participation finance does not reflect its true potential. In this regard, the Department of Participation Finance at the Finance Office was established as the main strategy development, coordination, and product development unit in participation finance in Turkey. Here, I am once again underscoring the strategy development role of the Department of Participation Finance, since it is also intimately related to the overall ESG and sustainable strategy of the participation financial system. Before delineating the participation finance strategy document from the lens of sustainability and climate change, let me briefly summarize what has been done at the intersection of participation finance and sustainability in Turkey. As you know, the concept of sustainability has become a strategic area of action with the 11th Development Plan of Turkey in 2019. And another important turning point was the Green Deal Action Plan in Turkey in 2021. And the action plan includes 32 objectives and 81 actions under 9 categories to support the country's transition to a more sustainable and greener economy in line with the European Green Deal. Subsequently, the Paris Climate Agreement was ratified by the Turkish Parliament in 2021. The launch of the Green Deal Action Plan of Turkey accelerated the policy actions, implementations, and practices in participation finance as well. Here, I want to highlight several recent achievements within the scope of sustainability related to participation finance. First of all, Capital Market Board of Turkey issued guidelines on green debt instruments and green lease certificates in November 2021. This guideline is prepared on the basis of ICMA green bond principles. This is a significant step for issuing green sukuk. Secondly, participation banking strategy update report covering 2021 and 2025 indicates that the participation banks will increase the product range in compliance with ESG. Thirdly, a public participation bank, Emlak Katılım, has developed the sustainable finance and green and social sukuk framework to be a reference for potential investors who will invest in green or social sukuk. Fourthly, last month we published, as the Finance Office, we published Green Sukuk report, which aims to be a reference for policymakers, sector players, and investors. In the report, we covered the concept and potential of green sukuk. We also juxtaposed the main problems issuing green sukuk in Turkey, and also we proposed some solutions. Given these developments, there are also green sukuk issuances by the participation financial sectors, mostly by participation banks. For instance, first green sukuk was issued in 2021 by Emlak Katılım. This issuance was awarded as a sukuk issuance of the year by IFM. Kuwait Türk also issued the first sustainable subordinated sukuk in the world. This is very important. And this issuance also was awarded as a deal of the year by the IFM. There is also another green sukuk issuance by the Turkey Wealth Fund, which is, as far as I know, the world's first sovereign green sukuk istisna. Given these developments and returning back to the participation finance strategy document, which will cover 2022 and 2025, by the way, we finished the strategy document and we are just waiting for the final approval. The main vision of the document is to secure a holistic transformation in the participation finance and to make the sector systematically important within the overall financial system. In our forthcoming participation finance strategy document, we take sustainability as one of the core pillars of the future of the participation finance. Under the general rubric of sustainability, we give special importance to green finance and impact investing in our strategy documents. Also related to your question, Bengüs Hanım, green finance is especially important given the national policy priorities to be compliant with the European Green Deal and to reach at net zero emission target by 2053. Let me share some highlights from the strategy document within the scope of green finance. In the strategy document, we define so-called areas of focus, which are the areas that we think that the participation financial sectors should give more weight in their practices, in their implementations. These areas are under 4 rubrics: strategic sectors, customer segments, types of financial products, and sustainability. If a participation financial sector, a participation bank, for instance, finances a business within these areas of focus, then they can be eligible for additional exemptions or incentives. So doing business at the intersection of these areas of focus will expand the exemptions or incentives in a non-linear way. To sum up, given the concept of areas of focus, initiatives by the participation financial sectors on sustainability will be awarded substantially. Another new institutional setup introduced in the participation finance strategy document is the participation finance rating system. This is not a credit rating mechanism. There is already a credit rating mechanism covering conventional as well as participation banks. But this system, this rating system, will evaluate the real sector and financial institutions with respect to their compliance to the principle and standards of participation finance. We propose, and we devised the system, or more correctly, we proposed the system in the strategy document, and we propose that sustainability should be a part of this rating mechanism. Moreover, public sector should take a more significant part in deepening green sukuk market, we believe. It means high volume of green sukuk issues by the public sector. In this regard, there are action items in achieving this goal in the strategy document. We also propose establishment of thematic research centers or institutions within the scope of participation finance. So we propose establishment of participation green finance centers in collaboration between universities and sector players. These were just several highlights from the strategy document. Finally, within the time limit, I want to mention about some of the risks that we think that are important. Of course, there are many challenges and constraints for the development of sustainability and green finance in participation finance, or within the scope of participation finance. Let me juxtapose some of them. Green financial literacy in Turkey is still low, and participation financial literacy is even lower than the general level of financial literacy in Turkey. In this regard, we think that the low level of participation financial literacy is an important impediment for the development of green finance in participation finance. Increasing awareness in this field is a key to increase investor demand for sustainable and ESG-related instruments. Turkey, as you know, has already issued Green Deal Action Plan, but we think that a sustainable and green finance strategy document, a context of which ranges from monetary policy to SME finance, should also be published, should also be prepared by the public sector or NGOs. Issuing cost is another issue, and it is especially important for issuing green sukuk. But we think that the support and incentive mechanisms will be introduced to incentivize issuing green sukuk by the private sector. Specific to participation finance, this is another, we think, another impediment. Underlying assets of sukuk issuance is an issue. For some types of sukuk, ijara sukuk, for instance, issuers should find appropriate underlying assets, and this is not always possible. In addition, reporting of the underlying assets is another issue. From a fiqh perspective, from a Sharia perspective, and underlying asset can be used just for an issuance. It cannot be used for another issuance. So, and international investors are looking for reporting of these underlying assets to be sure that there is no multi-usage of an underlying asset for more than one issuance. So there should be a separate reporting mechanism. It should be developed. And finally, this is not specific to participation finance. This is an issue for all of the capital markets, the short maturity of sukuk. Unfortunately, as I told you before, maturity is a common problem for the development, common impediment for the development of capital markets in Turkey. We are working on some solutions, but I cannot for now give the details. Yani, related to the short maturity is also related to reporting, yani impact reporting of these issuances. In a short maturity, how you can prepare an impact report. This is another issue. So, under the time limit, this is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Çok teşekkürler Tarık Bey. Yani kısa zaman içerisinde hem çok önemli gelişmelere işaret ettiniz. Gerçekten bunları duymak çok sevindirici. Özellikle de hani katılım bankacılığı, katılım finansı tarafındaki gelişmelerin aslında finansın bütün alanlarında özellikle ne diyeyim dönüşümü şekillendirici önemli şeyler içerdiğini de görüyoruz, anlıyorsunuz sizin söylediklerinizden ve kritik konulara aslında dikkat çektiniz. Çok teşekkürler, çok faydalı oldu. Ben şimdi sözü Turgay Bey'e bırakıyorum, Kuveyt Türk Katılım Bankası'ndan. Size de yine aynı soruyla geliyorum. Hem dilerseniz raporla ilgili yorumlarınızı ama bunun ötesinde aslında Kuveyt Türk'te gerçekleştirmekte olduğunuz faaliyetleri, stratejilerden bahsedebilirseniz çok seviniriz. Teşekkür ederim.
Engin Hanım, çok teşekkürler. İsterseniz ben de sunum kısmını İngilizce devam edebilirim. Sonrasında sorular gelirse cevaplamaya çalışalım. Belki bir sunumda yapabilirim. yansıtabilirim. Şöyle yapalım. Tamam, sunumu yansıtmamın şey yok. Sıkıntı değil, ben buradan devam edebilirim. Okay, let me turn in English. First of all, thank you very much for your invitation and for this opportunity. And I would also like to thank the Blake and the RFI Foundation for very detailed and informative report. Also, I would like to mention something regarding the report. Today, I will give you very brief information about our sustainability journey as a Kuwait Türk bank. Kuwait Türk also the leading participation bank in Turkey. At the same time, I would like to share with you the case study related to issues of subordinated sustainable sukuk, which our bank is just successfully completed last year, September. But before that, as a participation bank, I would like to start by summarizing by our philosophy on sustainability and climate change, because in the taxonomy of the Imam Ghazali for Maqasid al-Sharia, which is the objective of Islamic law, it requires 5 essentials for the well-being and the survival of humankind: the faith, religion, life, intellect, lineage, and the wealth or the property. Islamic finance is also the way that all Muslims and the human beings can realize and seek their human needs while adhering to Islamic principles. Sustainability also has been a new concept for financial industry as well as for Islamic finance. However, the objective of Islam, the comparing the sustainability, even though they came to closer from different angles. In this context, it's a duty as well as the inherently advantages for Islamic finance to join forces for the sustainability efforts and to respond to the scheme of the universe. And at that point, I would like to mention a little bit about our journey, because it is a strategic project for Kuwait Türk, the sustainability, establishing the sustainability strategy in the bank within many various fields. Firstly, we adapted our strategy in the 3 pillars of the ESG. Then we established our sustainability policy, which approved by our board of the directors. Then it takes the force from our board of the directors. Then we structured our sustainability committee, and the sustainability committee structured under our CEO, and all the EVPs is included this sustainability committee. Again, we have 4 different kind of working group under this sustainability committee. Their works also addressing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. With this working group, maybe I can mention the name of these working groups: the Sustainable Finance Working Group, the Climate Change Working Group, the Ecosystem Working Group, and the other one, the last one, is we call it informally the Changing Culture Working Group, but the Employee and the Communication Working Group. I think this is the most important working group for all of us. And under this working group, the Sustainable Finance Working Group, which is also, I'm just keeping the secretary of this working group position, then we established a framework for our first, again, the world first tier 2 sukuk issues in ESG based. Our framework, then we got our second party opinion from the Sustainalytics. This framework, I don't want to bore you with all of the use of proceeds, but also this framework is aligned with the ICMAS principles, International Capital Market Associations, green bond principles, social bond principles, and sustainable financing guidelines. Again, the LMA's green and social borrowing principles and the guidelines, it is aligned with this kind of principles then. And we established the framework, and the framework also including the 4 pillars of the ICMAS principles, the use of the proceeds, and process for project evaluation and selection, and management of proceeds, and the reporting. And we are at the stage of the reporting nowadays. We are really working on very hardly on that. And it is also hard for us and challenging. As you mentioned also in your report, the labeling the lendings is very important. And we are just experiencing it now. And amount of the equivalent net proceeds should towards to the eligible projects. I don't want to bore all of the eligible projects, but the climate change is our main target, and this is the main topic of this webinar. And I can say that what we did in our framework, we just addressed the all SDGs of the United Nations, but mostly the renewable energy and the SME financing, because it was a sustainable sukuk. But the renewable energy side, I should underline that our loan portfolios, 5%, more than 5% is coming from the renewable energy financing. It's a direct emission decreasing, but also your report is saying that the manufacturing behind this financing is really important. We are aware about that. The renewable energy projects that source from the solar, wind, bioenergy, hydropower, we will finance with this net proceed, and also rooftop solar systems, and also production and supply chain finance of the equipments for renewable energy, and the R&D projects for the renewable energy. Again, in the second line, we are targeting the energy efficiency. As a bank also, we are promoting the A-class energy certificate holder properties mortgage loans. It is really important for us on the energy efficiency side. Again, maybe I should underline that, as Blake mentioned, the participation banks, because of their natures, we need to finance the real goods on the financing side, the lending side. So the vehicle financing is a really good amount on our loan portfolio also. What we are doing on our strategy, sustainability strategy now, just trying to find a way to finance much more hybrid electricity vehicles, and for the bicycle financing for the small cities. Also, it is included our framework on these issues. And again, in addition to this, the funding the coal-related activities in this framework is prohibited. And we have an unfunded activities list that we implemented our credit policy. It is also approved by our board of the directors. And our issues at the end of the day completed very successfully. As you mentioned on your report's opportunity side, we accessed very new investor base, because mostly these sukuk issues is just taking on the order book very huge appetite from the GCC regions because of the religious purposes. But on that issues, we got the appetite more than quarter of the total order book came from the other continental Europe countries, especially the 20% of that was the dark and the light green funds. And we decided to distribute them on the order book, and we just think about that. We don't excuse much more that, because it was really successful pricing and the yield coupon for us. Maybe I can also need to highlight a little bit about that. We benefited from this feature also. It is the first sustainable Tier 2 sukuk, subordinated sukuk in the world. And it is the first sustainable Tier 2 comes from the Islamic financial institution. And also, again, it is the best yield coupon sukuk issuance since 2017, and really strong demand, as I mentioned, and 20% of a new investor base related with the sustainability funds. And it is the largest order book that have ever achieved by a financial institution from Turkey. That is really important also. It's really groundbreaking issues for us. So maybe before the ending the time, I need to also add something on the risk side. As I mentioned, we are trying to find a way to landing on the electricity vehicles and hybrid vehicles and the bicycle financing. Also, we are trying to strategically decrease the mortgage, then giving the retail financing to energy efficiency consumption. And also, maybe there is a risk which mentioned by Mr. Tarık. I need to add something on the underlying assets. Also, there could be another risk point on that, the underlying assets. The ijara-based underlying assets, if it comes from the properties or the buildings, that's fine. Maybe there is not a big risk for the sukuk issuances. But if it is come for the leasing financing, again, it is including the risk of the manufacturing side emissions that is included on your report, I think so. Maybe I can add this one. Also, I would like to end my speech like this. There are many actions taken by the financial institutions. One of them, as we are a bank, of course, we should provide financial products linked with the ESG and sustainability or the climate change mitigation. That we are doing with our sukuk issuance. Also, we have a 100% subsidiary KT portfolio. They established and they are managing the first and only Islamic fund, which is investing the ESG related equities and the sukuks on their portfolio. And again, we are just trying to find a way to provide a service for trade finance activities in an ESG related, because the trade finance activity is very linked between the manufacturing and the supply chain. I think this is very important that we are working on it. And secondly, the stakeholders we need to increase the awareness of the stakeholders. I think the lastly and the most important one is the increasing the awareness of the climate change mitigation and the ESG sentiment of our stakeholders, including our employees, including our clients. And what we are trying to do, also we are serving them. We are providing them the education videos on our websites or on our e-learning platforms. Also, what we are trying to do for our employees also. We have many various type of projects on that. We removed all the trash bins and we changed it with the recycles, and we are changing our credit card materials for the recycle. These are the very limited, but the most widened one, increasing the awareness of the climate change mitigation understanding on our employees and the clients, I think so. Thank you very much again, and I don't want to take much more time because I ended my timing also. Thank you very much.
Çok teşekkürler Turgay Bey. Özellikle katılım bankacılığı tarafında yeşil katılım bankacılığının genişlemekte olduğu, talebin de özellikle yükseldiğini duymak çok güzel. Konuşmanızda da dikkat çektiğiniz bir kısım var aslında. KOBİ'lerin finansmanı, yani burada da bu finansman içerisinde sadece yenilenebilir enerji verimliliği gibi hani çok önde olan alanlar bir yana aslında dönüşümde geri kalması muhtemel KOBİ'lerin bu dönüşüme nasıl katılabileceği, örneğin işte otomotiv sanayinden bahsediyoruz, elektrikli araçlara dönüşte Otomotiv yan sanayi buna nasıl mesela uyum sağlayacak? Bunların finansmanı, ki finansmana erişimde en şey yapan, zorluk çeken kısımda KOBİ'ler. Oraya da şey yapmak, dikkat çekmek çok önemli. Bu dönüşümün bütün açılarıyla finanse edilebilmesi açısından katkılarınız için çok teşekkür ediyorum. Sorular var mı diye ben şimdi katılımcılara dönmek istiyorum. Sohbetten, aşağıdaki sohbet sekmesinden ya da el kaldırarak sorularınızı sorabilirsiniz. Bu anonsu yapmamıştım tabii oturumun başında. Soruları olan varsa alabilirim. Ya da Blake, if you would like to comment any of the talking points for both Tarık Bey and Turgay Bey, you are also welcome to do so. İbrahim Bey, evet, elinizi görüyorum. Buyurun, mikrofonunuzu açabiliyor musunuz mikrofonunuzu? Evet.
Açabiliyorum. Merhabalar.
Tamam.
Teşekkürler herkese güzel sunumlarınız için. Benim aslında 2 tane sorum olacak. Hem Turgay Bey'e hem Tarık Bey'e. Tarık Bey'inkiyle başlayayım. Tarık Bey, bir teşvik mekanizmasından bahsettiniz. 4 alandan oluşan ve işte bu alanlarda kesişim noktasında iş yapıyorsanız belli teşviklerden faydalanabileceğiniz. Bu teşvik sadece katılım finansmanıyla mı alakalı ya da katılım finansmanıyla alakalıysa genel tüm finansal sisteme aktarılmasıyla ilgili en azından Cumhurbaşkanlığı Finans Ofisi'nde böyle bir çalışma var mı? Bunu merak ediyorum. Turgay Bey'inkini de sorayım isterseniz. Turgay Bey, siz de bisiklet ve elektrikli araçlara özel bir kredi türünden bahsettiniz. Elektrikli araçlar tabii gelecekte çok önemli olacak. Hem yani yollarda kalmayacak çok kısa bir süre içerisinde. Hem de aslında bahsettiğimiz genel sunumların da raporun da konusu olan işte dönüşüm için de önemli bir şeyleri olacak, rolleri olacak artmasıyla işte bu vehicle to grid dediğimiz sistemle aslında bir yerde depolama sistemi olarak kullanılıp şebeke operatörlerinin de işine yarar bir hale gelecekler. Benim sorum aslında daha pratik bir soru. Bu koşulları taşıyan ürününüz çıktı mı? Şey için, elektrikli araçlar için. Bir de bunun normal taşıt kredisinden farklı koşulları ya da oranları vesaire var mı? Teşekkür ederim tekrar.
Tarık Bey, buyurun.
İbrahim Bey, sorunuz için teşekkürler. Şimdi bu tabii strateji dokümanı, strateji belgesi bir mevzuat metni, yani kanun ya da işte bir yönetmelik gibi bir şey değil. Dolayısıyla orada önerilerimiz var. O önerilerin hani yansımaları, uygulamada yansımaları ne olur? O zaman içinde hani belirlenecek bir şey. Tabii biz katılım finansa özgü, ona özel çalıştığımız için sadece bu alana dönük önerilerimiz var. Tabii onların nasıl olacağı ilgili şimdi lansmanına çıkmadığımız için inşallah çok yakın zamanda çıkacağız. O detayları veremiyorum şu anda. Ama katılım finans sektörlerinin belirli kritik alanlarda daha fazla yol alması, daha fazla odaklanmasına yönelik yani destek ve teşviğin olması gerektiğini biz düşünüyoruz. Böyle cevap vereyim, olur mu? Lansmandan sonra sorsaydınız çok daha rahat cevap verebilirdim.
Teşekkür ederim.
Ben cevaplayayım. İbrahim Bey, teşekkür ederiz sorunuz için. Şöyle aslında hani konuşmamda da söylediğim gibi ben yani şuradan başlayarak cevaplamak istiyorum. Şimdi bu teşvikler henüz tabii Eylül 2021'de biz bu ihraca çıkmıştık ve o dönemde henüz bir şey de yoktu. Bir framework de yoktu. Otoritelerimiz tarafından yayınlanmış. Birazcık gönüllülük esasıyla şu an sürdürülebilirlik ve iklim değişikliğine ilişkin şeyler ilerliyor. Malumunuz bankacılık sektörünün literatürde de öyle tarif ediliyor. Önce işte bir zorlama varsa zorlamayla, bir insentif varsa insentifle, sonra tamamen gönüllülüğe dönüyor. Bunların da örnekleri çok az. Ama aslında katılım bankacılığı sektörü bu manada bunun örneklerini de gösteriyor. Biraz önce söylediğim şey ise yine bu gönüllülükle alakalı aslında bizim stratejik projemiz kapsamında çalıştığımız alanlar. Ürün net bir şekilde de cevaplamış olayım. Henüz böyle bir ürünümüz çıkmadı. Buna ilişkin farklı bir şey var mı? Hayır, yok. Çünkü hani buna ilişkin sunulan finansman ürünlerine de farklı bir teşvik henüz daha uygulanmış bir teşvik yok katılım bankaları içinde. Ama biz burada olabildiğince bankamızın hani bu anlamda bir stratejik plan ve programı var sürdürülebilirliğe ilişkin. Bu yolları arıyoruz. Yani elektrikli araçlar şu anda da finanse ediyoruz. Normal finansmanla aynı oranlarda gidiyor. Framework'ümüzde özellikle belirttiğimiz alanlardan bir tanesi. Hatta onların tabii hibritlerin özellikle belirli karbon emisyonunun altındakilere biz mesela aldığımız finansmanı kullanmak üzere belli sözler ya da commitment'lar verdik diyeyim. Farklı oran ve teşvik maalesef yok. Ürünü de henüz daha arkadaşlarımız çalışıyorlar. Kredi tarafındaki arkadaşlarımızın çalışması altında.
Çok teşekkür ederim size de.
Teşekkürler. Başka soru görmüyorum ben. Gözden kaçırıyorsam lütfen beni uyarın. Ama eğer başka sorunuz yoksa ben Blake'e dönebilirim. Belki eklemek istediği, bütün bu değerlendirmeler, gelişmeler ışığında söylemek istediği son sözleri varsa onu alabiliriz. Ardından da yavaş yavaş kapatalım süremizi aşmadan.
Yeah, I think reflecting on some of the comments before, specifically around sukuk issuance and the role of underlying assets. So the considerations for the Sharia purposes, but also for the green purposes. In the past, the ICMA standard, which has been referred to multiple times, that'd be the green bond principles, has confined its scope to treating sukuk and bonds equally, looking solely at use of proceeds when evaluating green eligibility. And I think that there's been some recent updates to the guidance specifically around green securitizations that it's not clear at the moment how that will impact sukuk, because sukuk aren't strictly speaking securitizations, but they reflect some of the structural components of securitizations as it's defined in the guidance note from ICMA. And so it's unclear whether that's going to increase the scrutiny around and the reporting requirements around sukuk. And so I think it'll be something we'll have to see how that develops, because in sukuk, like an Ajara sukuk, so a sale leaseback structure, the underlying asset may differ from the ultimate use of proceeds. And so under the current guidance as of January, only the use of proceeds was analyzed against the sustainability or the green finance framework. But it's unclear whether the new guidance around securitizations would also capture sukuk and expand that that review to also include both underlying assets as well as use of proceeds, which would create a distinction in how sukuk were treated versus bonds. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how that develops in the market as more green sukuk are issued post this new guidance, and it just reflects the kind of dynamic nature of the guidance and the market practice in the entire green finance sector. And I think unless there were other questions, just as a kind of wrapping up from what I've heard also, it sounds like we've heard some concrete examples of how participation finance and other financial institutions in Turkey are addressing climate-related risks. It's always important to see financial institutions that are taking steps forward, and strategic documents from the public sector also to guide some of that development. It's going to be a continually evolving process, and I think the approach that has come on the global level from the Basel Committee, for example, is fully aware of this, and Network for Greening the Financial System also. So looking at all of the focus on climate-related risks as being an iterative process, whether it's shortage of data, shortage of skilled staff, or customer understanding. There's lots of potential barriers, and it's about kind of working from where we are, and incrementally improving and dramatically changing over time the way that the financial sector approaches financing decisions in light of financed emissions. And so I think I would like to thank SEFiA and Bengisu for co-organizing this event today, and turn it back over to her for final remarks.
Ben de teşekkür ediyorum Blake'e bize bu fırsatı verdiği için, aslında önemli bir rapor üzerinden gelişmekte olan bir alanı tartışma fırsatı verdiği için. Çok teşekkür ediyorum. Tekrar bütün bu konuşmaları yaparken şeye döndüm, baktım. İklim Şurası'nda yeşil finansman konusunda neler önerilmişti diye. Orada pek çok işte teknik uzman çalışma grubu gibi aslında sürece destek verecek farklı yapıların tanımlandığını görüyoruz. Bu da ihtiyacından doğuyor aslında. Gelişmekte olan bir alan, yeni standartlar ortaya çıkıyor, yeni kurallar kitapları ortaya çıkıyor. Taksonomi çok önemli bir parçası bütün bu finans sisteminin işleyişi konusunda. Orada yeni gelişmeler var ve aslında farklı alandaki alanlardaki gelişmelerin koordinasyonu da çok önemli. Çünkü hiçbirini tek başına belli bir kurumun ya da belli bir alanın çözmesi mümkün değil. Bu açıdan bu diyaloğa devam edeceğimizi anlıyorum ben buradaki konuşmalardan da. Gelişmeler umut verici ve hepsi üzerinde derinlemesine çalışmaya değer konular. Ben de hem Blake'e raporları için ve bugünkü sunumu için, bize verdiği fırsat için, hem Tarık Bey'e hem Turgay Bey'e değerli katkıları için çok teşekkür ediyorum. Katılımcılara da bizi izledikleri için bugün çok teşekkürler. Biz bu konuları konuşmaya devam edeceğiz. Umarım yakın zamanda tekrar bir araya gelme şansımız olur. Herkese iyi bir gün diliyorum günün geri kalanında.
Teşekkürler, iyi günler herkese.
İyi günler.
Teşekkürler.